So the purpose of the event is to develop a common understanding on concepts associated with natural capital, natural assets, and natural services. If you're not here for that, you're in the wrong place. So I'm going to introduce Guy. Guy Greenaway. He is the Executive Director for the Corvus Center for Conservation Policy. Guy has 25 years of experience developing and managing projects related to landscape-level ecosystem analysis and management, conservation policy, and sustainable land use planning. Guy's areas of specialty include private land conservation, conservation planning, conservation communications, municipal conservation, there's a theme here, conservation policy development, eco-fiscal analysis, and conservation tool development. Guy has worked with over 25 Alberta municipalities, helping them to develop policy and tools in support of conservation. Guy has chaired the boards of the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation, the Alberta Land Trust Alliance, and the Small Change Fund. Worked as Executive Director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society, otherwise known as SALTS, and Senior Project Manager for the Mistaki Institute. Run 2 small consulting businesses and received BA and MEDS Design Environmental Science degrees. Whew. Renee, did you want to come up first? Okay.
Thank you so much, Flora. And good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. First, I wish to thank all the volunteers that came to help organize this event. It's just heartwarming to see. And also, I want to thank you for taking the time to attend tonight's presentations and be part of the discussions. Your participation will help our community engage meaningfully in a way that matters in the upcoming land use discussions. If any of you wish to join Bragg Creek's team, please do not hesitate to contact any of us or send an email to braggcreekwild@gmail.com. This evening as well is made possible by a few funders that we are now enjoying their support. Y2Y, or Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, is one of them. The Alberta Eco Trust Foundations is another one. The County of Rocky View also is supporting our work, and of course, your generous donation. Thank you for all of you who believe that wildlife and people can and ought to coexist peacefully. As you heard from Dr. Brad Stelfox last spring, an environment cannot be all things to all people all the time. Our area is under increasing pressure from the push for tourism and development, and the balance between preserving our natural habitats and supporting growth is becoming difficult. The issue we'll face as a community over the next 20 years are expected to be more challenging than anything we have encountered in the past 2 decades. The area structure plan for the hamlet and the expansion area is being rewritten to include increased tourism and development. But we as a community have the opportunity to use our power to influence what the future looks like. To help us unpack these issues, we're pleased to have with us Guy from Corvus Center for Conservation Policy, an expert deeply familiar with the complexity of land use policy, conservation, and sustainable development. Guy will guide us through the challenges and the opportunity ahead, offering valuable insight into how we can navigate these changes while protecting the integrity of our home and the wildlife we share with it. Tonight is meant to be informative and to prepare us for upcoming community engagement with the county. The feedback gathered during the breakout session later on this evening will be summarized into a document that will be widely distributed and that you can use as you see fit. As of late, I have been told that the following belief time and time again, and I'd like to share that one with you tonight. If we as a community do not know what we want, others will know what they want for us. Thank you.
Am I on? I am. Okay, thanks very much, Renee and Flora. I'm just going to do a quick switch here. Get us to my presentation. And get us rolling. Perfect timing. Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? If you don't answer, I gather that means you can't hear me, so you weren't able to answer the question. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is Bragg Creek's natural assets, yours to protect. And I want to really zoom in on the fact that I will be talking a lot about natural assets, not just those things, but that concept. Because as Renee identified, you guys are facing some major decision points, some major planning changes that are going to be happening for your area. And this is one of the concepts that's going to come up over and over again. But I also want to emphasize the protect part, because a lot of the time when we talk about these things, we talk about identifying them, understanding them, and especially in a municipal planning context, we kind of fall short. We stop before we get to the protect part. Okay, so introduction. Show of hands. Who here likes to curl up with a warm drink on a cold night and a nice policy document? Show of hands. Yes? Yes? My people. Okay. There's a support group meeting for us afterwards as well. Okay, so I've got some bad news. We're going to talk about policy stuff. But the good news is we're also going to have some fun. You're going to learn a bunch of stuff, and we're going to help, just like Renee said, help you guys come forward to be able to provide that voice for nature, which is really challenging as an individual citizen within a community. This is my promise to you. I'm only going to take you into the background and the theory and all the stuff I like to dig into on the way to the practical. At the end of this has to be something practical for you guys. What I'm going to talk about is nature and planning. And I'm going to talk about the intersection of nature and planning, because it's in that space that conservation can happen. And you'll notice I put can in quotation marks, or to set it aside to say it doesn't always, but it can happen here. And it's that difference that I'm hoping we can get at this evening. So the goals for tonight, first of all, I want you to go home with a better understanding of what a natural asset is, but more importantly, what it implies when you hear that term and when you hear that term used. Secondly, a better understanding of what the Greater Bragg Creek Area Structure Plan does and doesn't mean for the protection of nature. What's in there or what's coming that will help lead to protection of nature, and what kinds of things need to be looked at a little bit more deeply. And then third, that you better understand the role that you can play in ensuring natural features in your community are protected. So ambitious goals, those are our goals for tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk. I'm going to ask you guys questions, just a few questions as we go along. I'll give you an opportunity for you to ask questions of me after I'm done, and then at the end we're going to do table discussions, and I'll describe exactly what those table discussions are. But this is really important because this is the opportunity for someone other than me to talk and you guys to have your voice captured in a way that can be collated and brought forward, just like Renee described. Okay, so my talk, I'm going to start off talking about nature and concepts of features, functions, and services, Bragg Creek's natural assets, we're going to talk about that, and what it means to consider natural features versus natural assets. Then we're going to talk about planning, the role of a municipality, which is really important to understand because sometimes we don't get that part. The plans that sit over top of all of these decisions, and very specifically the Greater Bragg Creek Area Structure Plan, and Rocky View County's nature policies. Then we're going to talk about natural assets. And when I say we are going to talk about, yes, largely that means I'm going to talk about, but I will be asking you questions. Just what the concept of assets is, and then how that leads to natural asset management, and where we have some opportunities and where we have some challenges when it comes to doing inventories of that and evaluation of that and the kinds of slippery slopes that that leads to. But then we're going to talk about the difference between identifying those natural assets, those natural features, the things that are important to us in the community, and protecting them. And I'm going to go through a whole bunch of conservation policies and a whole bunch of conservation tools, and you guys are going to become experts in each and every, okay, no, you're not going to become experts, but you're going to get a familiarity with them, and we're actually going to ask you some questions about them. Do not feel like you need to be experts in these things. That's not the point. It's just knowing that those things are there, those tools are out there. So I think when you look across all of that, the one conclusion that everyone in the room is probably going to agree with is, I could have been at home watching Netflix. And yet here I am for a policy discussion on an evening when I could have been at home, curled up with that warm drink and a policy document, like some of us would do. Okay, nature. Natural assets. Who here has heard the term natural, like before you heard about this session, had heard the term natural assets before? Show of hands. Okay, awesome. And who here had heard the term natural capital? Okay. So natural capital is a term that grew out of the overlap of nature and finance, trying to understand nature in terms of finance. And natural assets grew out of this overlap between planning and nature. So it's really important to understand what that overlap is and, again, what that term sort of implies. So there's kind of a fine line between natural assets, natural capital, natural features. You'll hear these terms used, and they seem to be kind of running over top of each other. But I'm going to talk about natural assets and natural features very specifically, because when we talk about natural features, that's usually in the context of protecting nature. And when we talk about natural assets, that's usually in the context of serving humans, what's in it for us. And I want to be clear, nature serving humans is not a problem. It's just when that's the only thing that we think of, and that's the starting point and the end point. Okay, first piece to describe for you guys, yes, it does seem like you're in an ecology classroom. I apologize, but trust me, it's worthwhile. It's going to be fun. So a natural feature is a function and provides a service. If there is nothing else that you take away from tonight, I want you to fully understand this concept because it's so important. So in simple terms, the natural feature is the thing. It's the parts, it's the pieces. We can touch it, we can see it, we can point at it. And the function is what that feature does no matter what, whether we're nearby or not. It's just going to keep doing those things. But the service is the value that we identify. We specifically identify a value that we derive from that feature being able to serve that function. So I'll give you an example. Wetlands. Wetlands have a whole bunch of functions, and they do those things whether we're around or not. They're going to retain stormwater, provide aquatic habitat, they're going to replenish the subsurface aquifers, they're going to do all of that whether we're around or not. But then we derive several services from that, things that are important to us as people when we're nearby that. It helps us mitigate flood risk, helps us with drought mitigation, wildfire mitigation, pollution filtration. So when we're talking about conservation, we often get focused on the natural feature. Makes sense. That's what we see. It's on the maps. We have a very clear image of what that is. And when we talk about conservation, often when we see it reflected in plans or reflected in strategies, it's the service, because that's why we care, because it's providing something to us. But it's actually the function that is the most important for us to understand when we're thinking about conservation. And that's because that's where we have the greatest potential for management impact. So if you take this example that I showed you, the wetlands and the function, if we were to change that to constructed wetlands, then we'd have to take out a bunch of those functions. It may not be providing aquatic habitat. It may have a lining so it's not replenishing subsurface aquifers, which means that we have this kind of reductionist perspective on what that is providing. The reason that function is important is that when we focus on function, That allows us in policy, in planning, in rules and regulations, guidelines, we're able to target management action, and we can disallow things that impair the function, and we can encourage the things that are going to enhance the function or enhance the regeneration of those features. Okay, planning. One of the things that we as citizens and definitely as Albertans often don't understand is that municipalities have purposes. It's written in the Municipal Government Act, not just that you can do this or here's the planning opportunities, all of that. Purposes. This is what a municipality is set up for. And for years and years we've had this. To provide good government, to provide services and facilities, safe and viable communities. That's been around for years and years and years. And then in 2017, we added this. The purpose, not just a you can do it or maybe if you want to or put it in a plan, but a purpose of a municipality is to foster the well-being of the environment. And then in 2018, we added another purpose to work collaboratively. By the way, there is no prize for figuring out which governments introduced these changes to the legislation. Next, in 2022, we added another purpose to foster the economic development of the municipality. So this is a situation that we have when we're looking at municipal plans and we're trying to understand why municipalities are doing things. They have both of these purposes sitting side by side, and every plan has to accomplish something in support of these purposes. But this foster well-being of the environment is not a choice, it's a requirement. In fact, it's a fundamental purpose of municipalities. Then, underneath that, we need to understand the plans, the various plans that are part of the actions that are taken that can impair function of natural features or that can enhance or support them. So the plan hierarchy is the Calgary Metro Region Board Growth Plan, the Municipal Development Plan. Every municipality of a certain size has to create one of those, and same thing with the Land Use Bylaw. The Land Use Bylaw is where all of the districts and zones and that sort of thing are. And then a specific area, like the Greater Bragg Creek area, may have an area structure plan for it, and underneath that, very specific local plans. And what's important to understand here is that there's kind of a dividing line here. Everything above that line is pretty vague. It talks in very general terms. But everything below that line is very explicit. So when we start getting to area structure plans, we're getting to very explicit stuff. And another way to think of this is that above that line lists all of the things that we could do, but below that line lists the things that will happen, that will be done. So I've put that hierarchy here, and I'm just going to describe them very briefly. The Calgary Metro Region Board Growth Plan. So this is the one ring to rule them all plan. It's for the entire Calgary Metro Region, including Rocky View County, and it identifies growth areas, including the hamlet of Bragg Creek. It's an identified growth area within that plan. Also, beside that plan is the requirement that all municipal development plans and area structure plans have to be approved by that board. So it's not just Rocky View County, it's that board and that growth plan that these things have to align with. The municipal development plan covers the entire municipality, including this tiny little area down in the bottom corner, the Greater Bragg Creek area. And that's bounded by the borders of public land, that's Tsuut'ina Reserve, Foothills County to the south. So it's kind of a pocket in terms of planning that we have here. So the municipal development plan, what we call a statutory plan. In Rocky View County, they call their municipal development plan, their MDP, the county plan. And it lists everything that we want to do in a municipality. And so you see all of these repeated uses of words: may, shall consider, wouldn't it be nice, hopefully, possibly. But Brad emphasized this so much, and Renee repeated it. We can't do it all. We can't do all of those things all the time in all places. There is not enough time, there's not enough money, and there's definitely not enough space to do everything that's suggested in a municipal development plan. So what you see is actually enabling clauses, meaning everything has to connect to it. So to think of it in a different way, it's like just because it's in the MDP does not mean it will happen. But if it's not in the MDP and it hasn't been enabled by the MDP, then it's not going to happen. So sometimes we look at those MDPs and say, hey, it says that we're going to protect all of this stuff. That's awesome. That's great. No, it says that we might. It says that it could be considered. Okay, the land use bylaw, this is the place where we have districts, sometimes call it zoning, that's actually an American term, but we use that term all the time. So it categorizes all these land uses across the municipality. Most of those categories are development categories. It's intended to facilitate development of certain types, but there are some other types. It also includes all of the development principles and the practices that apply across the entire municipality. One of the things it does for each one of those areas, each one of those districts, is lay out the permitted uses and the discretionary uses. So you can do it without having to get extra permission. If it's a permitted use, you might be able to do it, but you have to get permission for it. If it's discretionary, it's not on either list, you can't do it. Which is actually not true until you get rezoning and then you have it changed and all of that. So none of this stuff is set in stone, but theoretically that's the way the process works. So I'm going to give you one example, one district. This is a special district as opposed to residential agriculture, and it's natural open space district. Its purpose sounds great. Create conservation areas or protect environmentally sensitive areas by restricting development and providing access to the public in a manner that says programs, I'm pretty sure it means protects. The spell checker at Rocky View County doesn't work sometimes, and preserves the land. The permitted uses, accessory buildings under 90 square meters. Discretionary uses, accessory buildings over 90 square meters, communications facilities, recreation outdoor, recreation culture and tourism. In the context of these districts and the process of districting, you can see the disconnect. This is what it's supposed to do, but those are the permitted and discretionary uses. So all of that is kind of geared towards there being some activity, some development. And so it's very hard to use districting or zoning to facilitate conservation. I'll give you another example of this. So this is essentially the greater Bragg Creek area in terms of the plan area, but in terms of just the border around the area for Rocky View County. Everything outside of that line is not Rocky View County. Okay, so you've got this area. This is the area that shows up in the plan, because the plan focuses on parcels. Everything's about parcels. So each one of these little bits is a parcel, sometimes subdivided parcel. But, actually, back up. Most of these are just a default zoning. It's called general agriculture. And it doesn't really have a lot of direction or character within that. The ones that are specifically given a district are these ones. And the districts are given agriculture, small holdings agriculture, business, commercial, just those gray areas in the hamlet, institutional, that includes Bragg Creek Park, direct control, I'm sorry that doesn't show up very well, it's a zoning that is not a zoning. It allows council to sort of do whatever they want in those areas. It's an overstated, editorialized description, but essentially that's it. And then the rest of this is residential. And here's the natural. The only thing that's zoned for natural in this entire area is that little strip. So when we look at zoning, we shouldn't be looking at zoning as being the solution, the way that we're going to get to conservation. Area structure plans, tons of area structure plans for different areas all through the municipality, also a statutory plan. And what the Municipal Government Act says these things do is show the sequence of development, the proposed land uses, the density of development, general location of major transportation routes, and public utilities. There's nothing in there in the legislation that says that you have to consider the environment. Municipalities, including Rocky View County, choose to add that, but it's not a requirement. You can see, again, that the plan is organized around how do we develop. So not every area has one. What they do is provide the where things are going to happen and some of the how, but not all of it. And one of the most important things it does is enable the next level down, sometimes called local plans. In Rocky View County, they're called conceptual schemes. And this is where we have area-wide environmental issues considered at kind of a broad scale. So all of the work that's being done right now by your visioning committee, the work that's been done by Bragg Creek Wild for the area structure plan, is all kind of under that aegis. We're going to talk about that in a second. So local plans are the lowest level down. The purpose is to provide this non-statutory framework that provides these things. Subdivision and development of the land within that area, future potential subdivision, and parcel-specific environmental issues. Okay, so let's look at Bragg Creek's plan. Bragg Creek has an area structure plan for the greater Bragg Creek area. It was created in 2007, updated in 2016, and is being redeveloped right now. The terms of reference are what have been created and finalized so far, and the objectives under that say that they will aim to achieve the following objectives: to identify key environmental and natural features within the area and suggest methods to uphold their form and function. This includes the development of policies to minimize the impact of development on the natural environment. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Aim to achieve, identify, suggest, minimize the impact. There's very little in here that says you will, you must. It's all very aspirational terms. So when you look at something like this, you have to be able to dig in a little bit more and say, okay, what actually are they going to do? What are they going to be required to do? And we're going to get more into that and your role in making sure those things happen. Here's something that I think is important to understand. It's a little bit odd, but this is the way that proposals to municipal governments speak about the environment. So all of the proposals speak to a variety of values, but they speak to environment in a very different way, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's say a proposal comes forward, and it talks about this development that we're going to create is going to provide all of these things for the community in terms of health, employment, economy, services, and the environment. And when it talks about most of these things, it talks about them in a contributory way. So where health, we're going to increase the available services, add new jobs, this many dollars worth of new economic activity, increase the community services. But here's the weird thing. When we get down to environment, there's a whole new category created. It's just harm reduction. So then we say we will limit the amount of nature we destroy, which is a really weird way to promote something and tell you about the wonders of it. So let's imagine we reverse that and said, we're going to limit the number of people who die, we're going to limit the number of people who lose jobs, limit the drop in economic activity, and limit the decrease in power supply. That would be a very uncompelling proposal. So one of the challenges for us is to move that over and say, no, this proposal needs to tell us how are you going to add to and protect that flow of ecosystem services? How are you going to maintain those functions of those natural features that are important to us? Okay, natural assets. First of all, why do we care about this concept? So Rocky View County is creating a natural assets inventory. I wrote for the Greater Bragg Creek Area Structure Plan. I just saw the request for proposals that they put out. It's actually going to be focused solely on the hamlet, but some of the proposals that go in might suggest something further. You guys need to know what that does and does not mean for the natural features in your community. And not just because it's being created for this particular area structure plan, but you will see that concept coming up more and more. So I'm going to ask you guys, first of all, before I go through what it all means and implies, what do you guys think are some of Bragg Creek area's natural assets? Just throw them out. Just give me an idea of something you think is a natural asset for the community. Okay, I heard river, heard a bunch of other things at the same time. I'm sorry, I didn't pick them up. What else was said?
It was the same. It was the Elbow River.
The Elbow River? Trees? Wildlife? Wetlands? Sorry? Riparian areas? There was something at the back there? Space. Okay, yeah. I think that there's no one who would sit in this room, hear your answer to that question, and disagree with it. So here's one of the problems with the use of this term. I always go to the Oxford English Dictionary when I'm trying to figure out what a term means. They've got two definitions for asset. A useful or valuable thing or person, like a sense of humor is an asset. And then the other one is, much longer, An item of property owned by a person or company regarded as having value and available to meet debts, commitments, or legacies, i.e. financial value. So when we use the term asset, people who think in the realm of money will use that concept of assets. But people who think in the realm of nature, nature conservation, will do what you guys just talked about. These are things that are valuable, things that have a value to you, and you did not talk about whether or not they were available to be liquidated to address debts. Okay. Natural assets came out of the concept of natural infrastructure, which is, I think, a good concept. It's just this recognition that nature provides all of these infrastructure services. Water retention, pollution filtration, climate change adaptation, all of these things. And these can be identified, they can be planned, they can include plans for the protection of them, for the increase, the augmentation of them, restoration. So all of that, I think, as a concept is a good thing. What has happened over the last 10 years has been an increase in asset management as a concept all across the country in all municipalities. They're learning how to do just the management of assets in general. So when we're talking about natural assets and natural asset management, we have a lot of examples of how that has been done. So it's a specific approach used in the municipal context, not really used in any other kinds of contexts. Most often, we'll see examples like this one from the town of Gibsons. It's about stormwater, it's about coastal protection, and largely it helps us contrast what they call gray and green infrastructure. So gray infrastructure, the stuff we build, that we use concrete to create, and then green infrastructure, the things that do that for us by nature and that we didn't build. So with this process, we can cost these assets and then add them to the municipal asset management system. So what that means is if there's an acquisition cost, a maintenance cost, a life expectancy, and a replacement cost, we already know the Parks Department thinks about park benches that way and says, okay, it's this much to acquire it, this much to maintain, it's going to last about this long, and then we replace it. The whole idea of natural asset management is to say, what about the trees in behind the bench? We can do the same thing. What does it cost to buy and plant one? What does it cost to maintain it over its lifetime? How long is it expected to last, and what will the replacement cost be? So it fits within that mechanism to include it in an asset management structure, but that's probably not what you guys were thinking when you thought about the value of a natural asset. There's different types of natural assets. These are the one characterization of the fully natural ones: wetlands, riparian areas, rivers, streams, meanders, and then the built or engineered. And this is more a spectrum than it is two lists. So constructed wetlands, rain gardens, cisterns, and rain barrels, all of those things are using natural forces to create an infrastructure value, and all of these ones are entirely natural and created by nature as opposed to the ones built by us. So this is what, when you hear natural asset inventory, natural asset management, is likely being talked about. Are there pros to this? Yeah, there definitely are. It's a translation. People who speak money learn how to speak nature, and people who speak nature learn how to speak money. It's a way for us to get across that divide, which is really important to do. The financial valuation can get natural assets into the asset management system that exists. So the asset sheet for a municipality already has buildings and trucks and stuff. If we can include the natural assets, then that means that we're going to be able to put those things into a budgetary system. Some of the cons relates back to this. Remember I showed you this, the wetlands and the function, and how constructed wetlands have fewer functions. Well, this is one of the problems when we do this asset valuation, that we can be kind of reductionist, and we only focus on certain services. Again, we're not focusing on the function or the variety of functions, just those particular costed functions. So one of the problems in doing that is that we can start to have this tendency where we're not valuing things that are valuable, we're valuing things that are easy to value. So data is available for them, costing information is available, and it's logical. But some of these things, like the social value of nature, the moral value, the aesthetic value, cultural values, we can put a dollar value on that, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a logical thing to do. So this is the challenge that we face when we start doing these kinds of inventories and valuation. So some inventories can be really good. I've put up an example from Fiera Biological Consulting in Edmonton. They do really good work in doing these kinds of inventories. But these inventories vary. They can be focused very spatially. These are the things within the community. These are just the natural features, the assets. Some of them can be more community-based, where we're gathering information from all of the people in the community to say, what is it that's valuable to you? And some of them can focus just on the features, but some of them do focus on the features and the functions and the services that are provided. A lot of these inventories may or may not have a valuation component. So it might just be an inventory, but it might also value those assets. And there's three ways that valuation happens. One is a financial assessment. Generally, what's the replacement cost of it? One is an economic assessment where you're looking at the impact on the broader economy. And then there are non-dollar assessments that are just saying, what is the value of that to a community? So it may or may not have a valuation component, and it can be different ways of approaching that. The key thing that we sort of forget to keep coming back to is, why are you valuing it? Why are you trying to put a value on nature? So there's two main reasons that traditionally we've done that. One is what I call making the case. We're trying to show that nature has value. It has economic heft. It's something that has always been outside of the economic system, and now we need to include it. And this started back in 1997 with this journal article in Nature, Pricing the Planet. That actually wasn't the name of the article in it, but they did an assessment of what is the value of all of the ecosystem services across the entire planet, trillions of dollars. But the other way is costing infrastructure assets, and these are very specific financial assessments. So, for example, you might have and we do have situations where companies are drawing water out of the stream. They need to return it for an industrial purpose. They need to return it back into the stream below a certain temperature. So what they'll do is create a cooling tower in order to cool it and then return it to the stream. But they may also decide that they want to invest upstream in maintaining cooler circumstances to begin with. Planting trees, keeping tree cover so that water is cool before it gets to them. They don't have to cool it down. They don't have to build a cooling tower. In that case, they're doing very specific calculations. And one problem is that we start to kind of confuse these things, where we'll say, oh, that acre of land over there provides so many ecosystem services. That asset has so many values. It does this and this and this. And when we add them all together, it's worth $1 million or $10 million. But the thing is, there is no one waiting with a checkbook to write a check for $10 million. So we sometimes get confused when we're using that argument just to show that it's valuable, and then it starts getting inserted into programmatic assessments like this kind. Okay, so like I said, we have to look at what our motivations are. So are we putting a dollar value on it because we value it, or do we end up accidentally doing the reverse, where we value it and it only has value and we can only include it in any valuation because we managed to put a dollar value on it? And this is a big problem with the approach to natural assets. So you have to ask, why are you valuing your natural assets? Is it that recognize it's got economic heft? Is it to facilitate trade-off calculations, like should we do gray infrastructure here or green infrastructure? How much would it cost? What's the difference between them? Is it simply to include it in a municipal natural asset management system just so it fits within the existing system? Or is it to facilitate the retention, the protection, the improvement of those natural features? So here's the problem. If it's this, it's very challenging. So if you are valuing this for protection, you have to be very cautious, because nature will always lose a financial battle. There will never be a case where you can make a comprehensive, conclusive argument. We can come up with some of it's going to be cheaper to keep the wetlands than it is going to be to build the dam. But eventually the problem we face is that we're choosing to debate in a language we don't speak. we're not valuing it for financial reasons, so we have to keep coming up with yet another financial reason, and we get this financial cage match where we're trying to battle out whether or not it should be gray infrastructure or green infrastructure. And that was not what we were there for. It's for conservation outcomes. And so it can be really difficult to achieve conservation outcomes using that approach. So, natural asset inventories and valuation, is it good? Is it bad? I think it's actually the wrong question, because I always say this: the builder determines what is built, not the tool. I was talking to a reporter one time about conservation easements, and she was pressing me, and she asked me, won't you admit that sometimes a conservation easement could be misused? And I said, you can use a hammer to build a house, or you can wing it at someone's head. That doesn't really tell you much about the tool. It's the user of the tool who determines what gets built, not the tool. So we have to keep this in mind when we're thinking about using this kind of an approach. Is it achieving our outcome? And an outcome around protection is really hard to achieve unless we're very conscious of that planning and nature interaction. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that in a second. So if you're actually trying to conserve nature, if you're actually trying to make that happen, you can really feel helpless. You can really feel like, how is this actually doing anything? How is this actually working? And especially as a community member, it can be incredibly, incredibly frustrating. So I want to talk about getting to conserved. Talked about identifying, talked about inventorying. I want to talk about how we get to conserved. So I'm going to show you a bunch of things that are kind of similar, but they have different categories. So first of all would be conservation policies. County-wide policies that would sit over top of an area structure plan, but would affect an area structure plan. And these are policies for how they do things versus what it is that they're going to do, like the policies that guide the activities and say how you should be doing it. And then there are specific conservation tools, land use and planning tools designed specifically for and employed specifically for conservation. I seem like I have been slamming inventories, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. We have to have those inventories. We have to have the data and the information to inform conservation, and some of that is very lacking in this area. And then there are community tools. These are tools that are initiated and maintained by the community. And Bragg Creek Wild is a great example of an organization that, in fact, a number of the things I'm going to talk about are actually already being done by Bragg Creek Wild. Okay, so conservation policies to begin with. One is a wetland retention policy. We often have wetland policies, and it's kind of, again, that harm reduction. Try not to destroy them too much. Try not to drain them too much. It would be great if you didn't. But a wetland policy can set out wetland avoidance and replacement requirements. Do that for all plan levels. It works with the provincial system of wetland policy, and it can outline county participation in things like the wetland replacement program, which exists across the province. Same thing for a riparian protection policy. It establishes that overall intent. First of all, it's our goal. We're going to protect riparian areas. Sets out the development and activity constraints, sets out the information needs, the required studies, and lays all of that out at a policy level and a requirement for anybody working within the county. Conservation design. Who here has heard the term conservation design before? Good. It's an often misused term in planning. You'll often see it in plans say, and we'll promote conservation design approaches, and then they never define what it means. The intent of the original conservation design process was to require 50% of the property, no more than 50% be developed and at a higher density, and then 50% of the property be conserved in perpetuity. Natural asset management plan lays out what the natural assets are, establishes the practices, identifies proactive options for protecting natural assets. Because this is something that I think as citizens we don't understand, how tied the hands of a municipality are when it comes to conservation. So many of the tools they have, they only get triggered at certain points. When someone applies for a subdivision, then they can do something. When someone applies for development, then they can do something. There's very few tools that they can use proactively, or that they tend to use proactively. Groundwater or source water protection plans, these are increasing all across the continent. Requires identification of all of the springs and aquifers, establishes development restrictions both for that area and in general around wells and springs, and then it outlines the required studies and monitoring. You may be looking at some of these things and thinking, don't we already do that? No, we don't. Nature positive development guidelines. So these are some, again, an emerging set of practices, but they can be created however you want them to be created. But they're at the conceptual scheme or development permit, those lower level plans and permitting, and it identifies the requirements and opportunities for development to provide this net positive impact on those natural features. So one of the things that's really cool about these approaches is it's not just the requirements, it's the opportunities. You lay out the things that are possibilities, ways that development proponents can add to nature in the area, not just extract from it. Wildlife corridor guidelines, something again that gets talked about a lot and very little implementation, but it creates and maintains the wildlife movement inventories, and then it requires that these be identified within any area structure plans, and it lays out what kinds of things like lighting, land use, setbacks, connectivity requirements would be included in those plans. Same thing with buffers and setback policies. First of all, it establishes the need to create these buffers around natural features, and then it lays out distance, or it lays out the methodology that has to be used so that any sort of activity or development is set back from water bodies, habitats, corridors, other natural features. The conservation tools, some of them, again, you might know about. This one is a pretty common one for municipalities, the environmental reserve, but despite its name, it's really only for undevelopable land. It's like steep, wet, flood-prone. And what it allows is that the municipality, when someone applies for subdivision, can take that land as an environmental reserve and maintain it in its natural state. Again, that can be really good for nature, provided you have good governing policies around that, because sometimes it becomes a municipal utility infrastructure kind of space as opposed to conserved for nature. This is new and very rarely used as of yet. Conservation reserves. So it's kind of similar to environmental reserves. Land with natural value. It can be taken at the point of subdivision. It has to be lands that aren't already eligible for environmental reserves, and it has to be compensated at full market value. And so it can protect natural features in the same way that the environmental reserves can, again, with governing policies around that. But the one little problem is you have to find the money to do it, because you have to buy it at fair market value. So in some ways it created an opportunity. It has been used creatively in some places like Calgary, but sometimes just as a standalone tool, it can be very challenging to implement. Conservation easements. Again, show of hands, who here has heard of conservation easements? Okay, a few people. So these are not a municipal tool, but municipalities can use them. And what it does is it places voluntary restrictions on a private land parcel, and those restrictions are there in favor of conservation. What happens, though, is that's registered with the title, and it runs with the land regardless of who the owner is afterwards. So it can be sold, it can be willed, it can be transferred, but those restrictions are still in place. And you can grant those to a municipality as a private landowner, but generally they're granted to a land trust or a conservancy and held by that entity, again, in perpetuity for conservation. While the landowner still owns the land and can still work the land and use the land as long as those conservation restrictions are maintained. Transfer development credits. Again, show of hands, who has heard of this tool? Okay, a couple of people. Used pretty extensively in the United States, very little in Canada. Alberta probably more than any other place. And can anyone guess which municipality has the only fully developed transfer development credits program in the country? It's Rocky View County. The Glenbow Ranch Area Structure Plan has a full transfer development credits program in it. So what happens is you identify development areas and conservation areas within a planning area, and you assign credits to the conservation areas that those landowners can then sell to the landowner in the development area, and that landowner can collect those credits and use them for bonus development. So it has to be enabled by the municipality And when you sell those credits, you have to put some sort of perpetual conservation, usually conservation easement, mechanism on that land. So the municipality creates the program, but they don't run the program in the sense that it's a willing buyer, willing seller kind of interaction between those landowners. Okay, protected natural areas, which again sounds like, don't we have those? We actually don't. In a municipal context, we don't really have a designation that is a protected natural area. But you can create that within a municipality and say, these parcels are acquired specifically for this. And then you add those designations, you add the ownership, the zoning, the land use controls, and you can do that with a land parcel that's purchased specifically to be a nature park. You can designate conservation easement lands or environmental reserve lands that way. But what it does is identify that that's for nature, whereas parks and open spaces, a categorization most municipalities have, doesn't really speak to nature conservation at all. Local conservation funds, tons of these in the US, a bunch of them in British Columbia. But what this does is the municipality establishes the fund, and then they fund the fund via a tax or a specific per parcel amount that everyone pays per year. It goes into that fund, and it's overseen by council like everything, but it's actually a citizen advisory group who figures out where that money is going to be spent, and then all of those funds are applied to local conservation projects. Riparian setback guides, we have a couple of them in Alberta. The riparian setback matrix model, stepping back from the water, essentially just the use of these science-based defensible guides for how much land should be set aside around these important water areas. And they can be used as just guidance for development, but they can also be incorporated into policy that says you must use this, again, science-based defensible process or another one if it achieves the same purposes. Inventories, local environmentally significant areas inventory. Again, you would think that that's sort of a basic thing. You don't have an environmentally significant areas inventory for this area. The county uses the provincial one, which many counties do, but that provincial one has a paragraph in the introduction that says, this is not at a scale that should be used for local planning decisions. It's a very coarse level, and it's not responsive to the things that are important within that individual community. So having something like this is really important. It categorizes, it helps you prioritize, and it becomes a base layer in your municipal development plan. Same thing with the wetland inventory. We have a provincial wetland inventory, but it's very ad hoc, it's very inconsistent. One area can be coarse and new data, the other can be fine data, but it's very old data, and it's all just sort of, I call it Franken data. It's all bolted together to create a border-to-border inventory. Many municipalities have created their own inventory. One of the reasons for that, obviously, is to help with conservation, but also it identifies the restorable or the drained basins that you could bring back, and again, facilitate some of that proactive conservation. A natural assets inventory, again, you might be surprised since I seem to be slamming this in a previous slide, but it defines and identifies those natural assets, and then it catalogs the functions, if it's done properly, and the attributes that these services are providing. One of the things that it can really help with is, like I described, that gray-green infrastructure comparison. Same thing with the riparian health assessment. There's a couple of different ways we approach this in the province: riparian health assessment, riparian intact assessment. In a sense, it doesn't really matter. The idea is that there is an assessment of the health of your riparian areas. There's a requirement that plans must include that assessment, and then there's conservation strategies that are, again, included within that plan. So like many of these things, this is about the tweaks to the area structure plan to say that it's not a fundamental change to it, it's just make sure you have these things included in it. This is something that rarely ever happens, conservation policy assessment. So we look at all of the things that we want to conserve. We don't really look at, do we have the mechanisms for it? And this is an important tool that municipalities can deploy, where they set conservation goals and then they see the policies that we have. Do they support that? Do they not support that? And you can draft new policies or revise the existing policies to try and support that. Wildlife movement mapping, again, this can be modeling that's done based on data that you have, specific data for specific species, or it can be non-species specific, just understanding where are the areas where we have bottlenecks, where are the areas that we have friction, and where are the areas we have flow. Okay, community tools, and I feel like this is going to be a rundown of everything Bragg Creek Wild is doing. Citizen science. So the citizen science concept is to have citizens doing collection of data and information, but doing it in a systematic way. It can be done with professional scientists, or it can be done separately and standalone. But increasingly, these data sets are being used as a basis for policy decisions in a lot of different contexts. This is one that doesn't often get used, but I think it doesn't often get used in North America. In Europe, a number of communities that face a lot of tourism and a lot of visitor activity, especially mountain access towns, the citizens will create their own code of practice, and it's for citizens, it's for visitors, it's for the businesses, it's also for local government, and it outlines what are the expectations, what are the standards of behavior in this area for each of those kinds of communities, those cohorts. It leads often to this as well, local certification, where the community creates a certification process that is a nature-positive certification. Lays out these standards and practices. If you adhere to them, then you as a local business can have this certification. And it's not a report card to identify the bad actors. It's a voluntary application, and it's intended to incent the local businesses to change some practices in order to achieve and be able to advertise that they have that. Community education, an example is here. There's several examples listed over there of things that have happened, supported by Bragg Creek Wild, things that are coming up, like Brad's talk in the spring. So it's the provision of information, information about nature, information about decision-making, information about what individuals can do, and then providing that information to decision makers more specifically to say this is what the community has learned, this is what the community has asked for. And visitor education follows a similar kind of pattern, but it's provision of that information to tourists, to recreationalists, to other types of visitors. And it can be information presentation, it can be signage, it can be all of those kinds of, oh look, information presentation, signage. So again, a number of things like Bragg Creek Wild is doing. That was a lot, wasn't it? Yeah. I went through a number of things, not with an expectation that you would see them, learn them, absorb them, and demand them of your decision makers, but that you were aware of these things. And we do actually have a list of all of the tools and policies that I just described, something that we're going to ask you to provide some feedback on. And again, not because I think that you're experts in this, but just what are the things that caught your attention? What are the things that strike you might be most applicable in the greater Bragg Creek area? Okay, so the now what? I want to just leave you with these few thoughts. There are things that we do get to do and things we don't get to do. In the don't, we don't get to choose if there's growth here. The population, the recreation, the tourism, the traffic, those are things that are generated by population growth. They're generated by the desire to be in an area, just like you have desired to be in this area. And we don't get to choose whether Bragg Creek is an area of focus for growth. And it would be tempting to blame that on, oh, the Calgary Metro Region Board designated this as a growth area. Oh, the Rocky View County has created an area structure plan that says this is a growth area. Those are pressures that are being responded to. There is going to be another 1 million to 2 million people in this area in the next 10 to 20 years. This growth and this pressure is going to happen. But here's what we do get to do. We get to choose what that growth looks like. So you get to choose whether the growth is regenerative or extractive. You get to choose whether it's directed in certain places or it's just random and happens everywhere. And you get to choose whether conservation is integrated in those growth plans or it's just an afterthought and doesn't actually happen. So another way to think of this is we can't control the if and the when, but you have a significant amount of control over the where, over the what, and over the how. And it's important not to get caught on that first one and the frustration that we might feel with that first one, and to get motivated and active with that second one. Okay, I just want to talk about regenerative tourism very quickly because it fits within exactly what I just talked about. Traditional, sustainable, and regenerative tourism all do the same thing. They provide tourism services and they derive financial returns. And over time, the last, say, 25, 30 years, we've had more sustainable tourism calls and businesses and practices where we're minimizing the harm to the underlying system. But regenerative tourism and regenerative living is about actively healing, actively enhancing the underlying system. And that started off as being a kind of utopian thought, and it's not anymore. It's becoming a very practical and pragmatic goal that there are ways of making happen. And a number of the policies that I just laid out can be oriented towards exactly that requirement. So I want you to think of that as one possibility, one way that that can happen. Okay, so using your voice, you can take this information, you can tell your spouse, that's what I do. It's not necessarily good for your marriage. You can tell your pals at the coffee shop, makes you feel good, doesn't necessarily create much change. And you can tell Bragg Creek Wild, and they will collect, they will combine, and they will widely share that information. So that's why we have the second set for tonight, where we're going to have you guys do table discussions. I'm going to turn it over to you guys to ask some questions in a second, but then we're going to go into those table discussions. And what we're going to do is you'll see tables all around here. We're going to get you to drag your chairs over there. Every table is the same. There are 3 discussion questions, and there are moderators at each of those tables that will help you through those discussion questions. And you will have an opportunity to participate and to provide that voice of what you think. So I really encourage you to do that, because otherwise the only voice that was heard was mine, and the only people who heard it was you. But if you go to those tables and you provide that feedback, then your voice gets heard, and that gets shared with Rocky View County and with others. So that is my contact information. I'm always happy to answer calls, have emails. And I want to thank you for your very patient attention on a topic that is not exciting, except to those of us who don't have real hobbies. It's not a topic that gets people excited, but it's such a critical one for you guys to understand in order to make conservation of those things that are so important to you happen. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions. Okay. There's a microphone there in the middle. If I could ask you to pop up to the microphone, then everybody can hear your question.
Hi, guys. So I'm, I don't even know if this mic is on, but I can talk loudly enough.
We can hear you.
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, a riparian system is like an engine, and we want to have healthy engines to provide us, so for instance, the ecological service of clean water or flood mitigation. The thing that I've been struggling with recently is how do you deal with valuation of, like, you know, there's a bunch of components that go into that system. So if we look at, for instance, the Elk Valley fens, those fens are kept the way they are because the moose that periodically come through, and a lot of those moose spend their winters north up in Sibbald and that area, and then come through. So it's a complex system, and we tend to reduce that to try and deal with the valuation and restrict it geographically, when in fact we have all of these components that are more widespread in order for that engine to work correctly. How do you deal with that concept?
So I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I don't have a perfect answer, and you're right. This is the wicked problem. One of my favorite jokes is ecological restoration. It's not rocket science. We know how to build a rocket. We don't know how to build ecosystems. They're more complex than we understand. And we know enough to know that that's the case. I would say that in these circumstances, one, make sure that the focus is on function, not just that geographic strip, how many meters from, and how. The more you can incorporate the function part of it, the more you incorporate some of those things that you just talked about. The way wildlife are benefiting from and the way wildlife are contributing to the function of that system, as opposed to just that reductionist, it does this one thing, it filters pollution from 3 meters away. The second thing is, I would say that when we get into these valuation conversations, valuation does not need to mean dollars. And I think that that's something that we miss when we start talking about valuation. Mark Carney used to be the governor of Bank of Canada, used to be governor of Bank of England. He wrote a book called Values, and it was values with the S in brackets. And the argument he made, which as others have made, is that we have moved from a market economy to a market society, where in a market economy, we valued things by the dollar value so that we could exchange them. So we had an apples to apples thing. But now we've started to have a market society where we're trying to put a dollar value on everything, and that's just simply not workable, first of all, from a valuation perspective, like a dollar valuation, but secondly, from what is it that we value. So I'd say in those conversations, you have to really work it back, push that argument back and say, well, why are you valuing it? What is the outcome that you are looking for in valuing it? Because if it's just to put a dollar value on it, if the goal is just to insert it in an asset management system, that's not accomplishing what that goal is. So stay outcome focused. Again, an imperfect answer for a good question.
Okay. Hi. I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, and thank you for hosting this, Bragg Creek Wild and Renee and the whole gang. And I just wanted to add a couple comments. There's a couple of folks like me here from the Chamber of Commerce in Bragg, as well as the Bragg Creek Community Association, and I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of context around how we are trying to approach more of a collaborative community, multi-party way of supporting initiatives and supporting each other and spreading that information. So this initiative has the support of the Community Association and of the Chamber, and we want to make sure that it's not just, this isn't the only vessel of support or the only leg that this initiative is standing on. So there is collaboration and consensus in other parts of the community. So thank you everybody for being here and for supporting it like we do. That was all. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for saying that.
Oh,
I think we can do one more question because we want to give you guys enough time to be at the back in those tables. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So from a perspective of the scope that the ASP covers, this doesn't cover the First Nation lands. This doesn't cover the MLA or the the Kananaskis Forest area. It doesn't cover the West Bragg Creek day use area. It just covers the hamlet itself. And in the description that you did of the first couple of areas, most of the hamlet's already zoned. So really you're looking at what can happen in the hamlet only. And if the area has already been zoned residential, that's already been put in the description, and you can decide whether or not you're going to have high density infills or not. There's only, as you identified, there's only one green space left. Other space has been allocated for recreational use, like this place here, for education down the road, commercial space, but that's just this space. Is there much space left that can be affected by the ASP and the changes that could be brought forward? Because it's already been allocated is what I'm kind of thinking. So
the area structure plan is for the greater Bragg Creek area. So it is a larger area than just the hamlet. But yeah, you're right. This has to be integrated into thinking much more broadly than just It's the reason why I wanted to put up those very segmented parcels, like thinking of it in just that reductionist perspective. Within the area structure plan, though, they're doing different things at different scales. So, for example, the natural assets inventory is only going to be for the hamlet. It's not going to be for the greater area. So it's those kinds of things that you definitely have to keep your eye on. And also, if you think that there should be a greater scope for planning or a greater intermunicipal or interjurisdictional kind of planning, that voice needs to be heard too. And Renee, I'm just going to turn it to you to clarify, because there was some things we need to...
No, actually, yeah, the ASP that is being reviewed is the hamlet, but the expansion area, which is from the White Avenue up to Highway 22 between the vet and the school. So that top of the hill down to the White Avenue and the hamlet. Now, when this is being reviewed, and it will, the desire is to increase development, increase tourism development, and residential, it will have an impact on the rest of the community by definition. So that we believe that West Bragg Creek or Wintergreen will not be affected, that's wrong. There will be more people, there will be more activity, therefore we will be impacted. Even though we're not those two other areas are not part of the planning process. Yeah, that's why we need to all be involved.
I think it's really important not to limit your feedback and your conversation to the lines that have been drawn on a map for you. If you think that some of the things that are being talked about need to have a broader scope, you need to say that. And we have this bad habit in Alberta of just responding to color within the lines. You gave me these lines, I'm just going to color within it. And when we try and step out of that, we'll be told, well, no, this is just a plan for, just keep pushing that, and saying, I know that's what your plan is for, but these systems go beyond that, these impacts go beyond that. Okay, that was a shorter time for questions than would be ideal. My apologies. I will be around to answer questions. I'm more than happy to do that. But again, it's really important that we get this feedback from you guys. So there will be moderators at the table. There are 3 questions that you guys have. Those 3 questions, the moderators are going to take you through, and they're going to be scribing on the wall for you. So what I'd like you to do is, it's BYO chair, drag your chair over to one of the tables. It doesn't matter which table you go to. Try and have a little bit of a spread so you're not all gathered at one table. And we will give you 15 minutes for each one of those questions. So once you get there, you can start that. Thank you very much.